This is Latter-day Presentations, where we discuss topics and issues of faith for Latter-day Saints. Welcome to today's presentation. In this presentation, we're going to talk about church history and testimony. And I want to begin this presentation by looking at a controversial article title, "I Don't Have a Testimony of the History of the Church." This article is based on a presentation by the late Latter-day Saint historian Davis Bitton. And yes, that title sounds controversial, doesn't it? But I hope that as this presentation proceeds, we will understand better what he meant, and why I say the same thing about my gospel convictions. And let's start by defining the word testimony. What is testimony? Testimony is a conviction that comes from personal experience. One of my favorite definitions for the word testimony comes from this book, Women Testify of Jesus Christ, by Elaine Cannon. Elaine Cannon served as General Young Women's president in the church. And here is what she said in the book about testimony. One who gives testimony is a witness. A testimony is a declaration of truth based on personal knowledge in support of an asserted fact that may serve as evidence to others when publicly made known. So let's talk about some examples of what testimony is. Think of this sentence. I have experienced a positive change in my spiritual life from studying my scriptures. Therefore, I can witness that regular scripture study is a spiritually positive commitment to make. Here we have experience, which forms the grounds for my personal conviction. And then we have a statement of witness testimony. So another example would be, I have experienced forgiveness of my sins after praying to God in the name of Jesus Christ. Therefore, I can witness that the atonement of Jesus Christ is real. Or another example, there is a very unique and specific promise in my patriarchal blessing that has been fulfilled. Therefore, I can witness that there is divine inspiration in patriarchal blessings. Notice that in each of these examples, testimony is expressed as something that is known as a result of personal experience. And hopefully that clarifies why Davis Bitton titled his article the way he did. I don't have a testimony of the history of the church. Let's go ahead and read an excerpt. When I say I don't have a testimony of church history, I mean that the gospel of Jesus Christ is not subject to scrutiny by the feeble tools of the historian. The creation, the fall, the redemption, the merciful plan of the great Creator, all these are simply not subject to proof or disproof by looking over old documents. On the other hand, the people who believed and accepted those doctrines are proper subjects for historical inquiry. In their achievements and failures, their high points and low, their trials and triumphs, in all the crooked timber of their humanity, these are imperfect people on the Lord's errand. They stumble and fall. They pick themselves up. They complain and lose their tempers. They become discouraged. They sometimes abandon ship. No one ever said that the history of the church was the history of perfect people. In fact, the church, as I understand it, is for the perfecting of the saints. It is very important to reiterate here that he is saying that the core of the gospel, the merciful plan of the great Creator, is not something that can be assessed or analyzed using the tools of a historian. Historians look at sources and they create narratives about history based on personal factors like their worldview and their interests and their interpretations of what sources say about the past. Because historians bring different personal factors to their craft, historical narratives are subject to debate. As a recent example, here was an interview given between American conservative commentator Tucker Carlson and a history podcaster named Daryl Cooper. In Daryl Cooper's podcast, he has been putting forward narratives that challenge people's understandings of World War II, saying, for example, that Winston Churchill was the real villain of World War II. In response to these narratives that Daryl Cooper promoted on Tucker Carlson's show, a historian said that Cooper spent his time peddling ahistorical conspiracies and lies. Let's look at another example. Some years ago, there was a movie made about the life of Abraham Lincoln, and it presented the life of Abraham Lincoln very favorably. But recently a book was written by historian Lerone Bennett Jr. called Forced into Glory, Abraham Lincoln's White Dream, where Bennett put forward a different narrative. He said, who freed the slaves? To the extent that they were ever freed, they were freed by the 13th Amendment, which was authored and pressured into existence not by Lincoln, but by the great emancipators nobody knows, the abolitionists and congressional leaders who created the climate and generated the pressure that goaded, prodded, drove, forced Lincoln into glory by associating him with a policy that he adamantly opposed for at least 54 of his 56 years of his life. Bennett concludes, there is thus nothing we can learn from Abraham Lincoln about race relations except what not to say or do. Now, hopefully at this point, as Latter-day Saints, you're recalling what was said to Joseph Smith by the angel Moroni, that his name would be had for good and evil among all nations. When we're dealing with historical figures, it is possible to create narratives that they were good or bad. If a historian is determined to create one narrative or another, they will find ways to interpret sources in accordance with their agenda. So why are there such different interpretations of history? You'll recall that in a past presentation, we talked about this triangle, where we move from data to information to knowledge and then to wisdom. Historical sources are at the level of data, and when they are interpreted, we end up with historical narratives. In some cases, historical narratives can rise to the level of knowledge, but usually they do not. For example, whether or not Abraham Lincoln was a good person is always going to be a subject of debate as long as there are people who believe he was a bad person. That question will never rise to the level of knowledge because it will always be debated. And what about historical evidence? This is a question where we need to spend some time, because something important to understand is that we make decisions about what we consider to be evidence for things. Our assumptions about the world and our life experiences determine our decisions around evidence. So if we imagine our thinking processes as being like a river, where there are things that are upstream that flow into downstream areas, assumptions and experience are upstream and conclusions are downstream. Conclusions are determined, are a product, are a function of upstream factors like assumptions and experience. Let's look at an example from the scriptures. If you recall, in Alma 30, Alma has a debate with Korihor, and that debate covers the existence of Christ, whether the church is good, whether church leaders are honest. And let's look at some of the phrases that Alma uses. He says, what evidence have ye that there is no God? I have all things as a testimony that these things are true. Thou believest, but thou art possessed with a lying spirit. So how do we think of this in terms of upstream and downstream factors? Well, in the case of Alma, direct experience of God and miracles is the set of upstream factors that determines how Alma processes evidence. Downstream of those factors, his reasoning is that nothing can be evidence against the existence of God. And his downstream view of evidence is that everything can be seen as evidence for God. By contrast, Korihor's lying spirit leads him to conclude that there can be no valid evidence that the church is what Alma claims it to be. And therefore, he sees evidence that Alma and church leaders are corrupt and that people's spiritual experiences are imaginary. Now, why would Alma say that Korihor had a lying spirit? Perhaps it is because Korihor had created these very negative and accusatory narratives, and he had presented those as if they were the only possible view of reality, when in fact other options were available to him. Korihor's upstream and downstream thought processes remind us of typical atheist views of evidence. A typical atheist upstream assumption is that there is no God. Downstream of that, there can be no evidence for God because God does not exist. And the downstream view of evidence is that none of the items presented to me are evidence for the existence of God. We also have miracles are not possible. Downstream of that, miracles are not experienced by anyone. Therefore, the downstream view of evidence is no witness testimony of a miracle is valid evidence for miracles. These downstream claims about evidence are determined further upstream in their thought processes. Let's look at an example from biblical scholarship, and this is New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman has been very successful in leading a lot of people away from faith, particularly evangelicals, due to critical things that he says about the Bible. In this book, God's Problem, Bart Ehrman talks about the problem of evil and how he thinks that the amount of evil and suffering in the world is an insurmountable problem from which we can only conclude that there is no God. Here is how he says it. Eventually, though, I felt compelled to leave Christianity altogether. I did not go easily. On the contrary, I left kicking and screaming, wanting desperately to hold on to the faith I had known since childhood and had come to know intimately from my teenage years onward. But I came to a point where I could no longer believe. It's a very long story, but the short version is this. I realized that I could no longer reconcile the claims of faith with the facts of life. In particular, I could no longer explain how there can be a good and all-powerful God actively involved with this world, given the state of things. For many people who inhabit this planet, life is a cesspool of misery and suffering. I came to a point where I simply could not believe that there is a good and kindly disposed ruler who is in charge of it. Now, it is not hard to see how this upstream determination that there can be no God because there is so much suffering in the world would affect his view of the Bible and the truthfulness of miracle stories or the resurrection, for example. If he has decided in advance that those things cannot be true, then all of his powers of reasoning and his scholarly tools are going to be employed in reinforcing these conclusions that he has already decided in advance. Now let's look at an example from Latter-day Saint history. And this is Dale Morgan. He was a former Latter-day Saint. And what we read here is from part of his correspondence with Juanita Brooks, who was a Latter-day Saint historian. He said, "Consider again how our individual points of view upon Mormonism and all religion are rooted in our fundamental viewpoint on God." Okay, so let's stop right here and recognize what he's saying, because he's speaking in terms of upstream and downstream here. Our individual points of view upon Mormonism and religion, which are downstream, are rooted in our fundamental viewpoint on God, or in other words, are downstream of this upstream factor, which is our fundamental viewpoint on God. At the other extreme, we have my attitude, which I believe is substantially Fawn's, and here he's talking about Fawn Brody, who was a critical historian of Joseph Smith. I feel absolutely no necessity to postulate the existence of God as explanation of anything whatever. To me, God exists only as a force in human conduct consequent upon the hypothecation of such a being by man. Now pay attention to what he says next. I believe I have about as great a reasonableness of spirit as anyone who has made inquiries in Mormon history. But I am aware also of a fatal defect in my objectivity. It is an objectivity on one side only of a philosophical great divide. With my point of view on God, I am incapable of accepting the claims of Joseph Smith and the Mormons, be they however so convincing. If God does not exist, how can Joseph Smith's story have any possible validity? I will look everywhere for explanations, except to the one explanation that is the position of the church. So we see here that he has decided in advance that some narratives are out of the question for him. I will look everywhere for explanations or narratives, except to the one explanation or narrative that is the position of the church. So his upstream assumption is that there is no God. Downstream of that, Joseph Smith could not have been a prophet because there is no such thing as a prophet. And his downstream view of evidence is that no historical data can serve as evidence that Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. These are choices that he made that limited what he could see and what he could accept. Now let's talk about choosing questions and how that becomes a choosing of our evidence. And here we have a slope that represents verifiability of claims that people make. And this slope is on a continuum of time that goes from past to present. So in the past, we have ancient history, like biblical history. We have early restoration history. We have recent restoration history, and we have the present day. Let's talk about the questions that we choose and how those correspond to time periods. Like in biblical history, you might ask, how was the book of Isaiah compiled? Or how was the book of Deuteronomy written? Those are historical questions that biblical scholars argue over constantly. And they are at the bottom of this slope of verifiability because they simply cannot be verified. All we can do is create competing theories and hypotheses, none of which can be actually verified by people in the present day. Now, moving up the slope of verifiability into early restoration history, we have questions that we can ask like, what was Joseph Smith thinking about any number of things? Or we have a question like, how did Brigham Young arrive at his views on the spirit world? And you'll recall that we discussed that in my last presentation on mind, spirit, and demons. And the answer is, we can't really verify an answer to that question. We can only make an educated guess. So again, these kinds of questions, since they also have low verifiability, though not as low as the biblical period, these questions are still debated endlessly by historians. Now, moving up the slope of verifiability into the present day, we have questions that we can ask about the present day state of the church and how we experience the gospel. We can ask questions like, do we experience the atonement of Christ? Do we experience the power of God in our temple work? Or do we experience the power of God in our missionary work? Those questions have extremely high verifiability from our personal experiences and from the experiences of people around us at church. For these questions, we can raise our hand in Sunday school and simply ask. And in response, we will get very credible, sober-minded witness testimony of direct personal experiences. So when we shift the focus of our gospel questioning from questions about the distant past to questions about the present day, our overall faith confidence level goes up. And when we do the reverse, our overall faith confidence level is likely to go down. Consider this passage from the book of Luke. And here we recall when John the Baptist was in prison, and he sent a couple of his followers to meet Jesus. And John, calling unto him 2 of his disciples, sent them to Jesus, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? When the men were come unto him, they said, John the Baptist hath sent us unto thee, saying, Art thou he that should come, or look we for another? In the situation that John was in, he was very confused, because most people like John had understood that when the Messiah would come, there would be a deliverance from oppressive government. And yet here was John suffering alone in prison. So we continue, in that same hour he cured many of their infirmities and plagues and of evil spirits, and unto many that were blind he gave sight. Then Jesus answering said unto them, Go your way, and tell John what things ye have seen and heard, how that the blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, to the poor the gospel is preached. Here, Jesus is expressing that he wants John to take his focus away from abstract expectations about the Messiah and instead bring his questioning into issues that he can personally verify. He wants John to move toward high verifiability questioning. And he concludes by saying, Blessed is he, whoever shall not be offended in me. Now, how do we choose questions for high verifiability? I've asked questions like these before in other presentations, and I'm going to review them here. For example, is there a God? Does Jesus Christ possess the divinity and power that the scriptures and modern witnesses claim for him? Does God utilize prophets and prophetesses to communicate his will and intentions for humanity? Was Joseph Smith a prophet? Did God ever communicate specific things to him about God's intentions for humanity? Did God ever really give Joseph direction in the establishment of the church? Are there special witnesses among Joseph Smith's successors in the current church? Was God involved in the production of the Book of Mormon? Did the witnesses actually see an angel and plates? And was there divine inspiration in its production? When people study the Book of Mormon, do they come to know God? Does God approve of and operate with the current system of prophet presidents of the church? Is Russell M. Nelson receiving divine direction in his calling? Does God approve of the deliberative decision-making processes used by the governing councils and executive committees of the church and honor their best efforts to convey his will? Our missionary work involves bringing people out of their current belief systems into the restored church. Is God involved in that work? Our temple work involves bringing people to the restored church as their final spiritual institutional destination, regardless of what their belief systems were in mortality. Is God involved in that work? Now, at this point, you might be asking, how do I verify these things? Well, on this last question about whether God is involved in our temple work, consider this witness testimony from a recent general conference in a talk by Elder Anderson.
Although many of our experiences in the house of the Lord are too sacred to share publicly, some we can share. 40 years ago, while living in Florida, Kathy and I traveled to the temple in Atlanta, Georgia. On Wednesday night, May 9th, 1984, as we completed a session in the temple, an ordinance worker approached me and asked if I had time to do just one preparatory initiatory ordinance. The name of the person I represented was unusual. His name was Eliezer Searcy. The next day, the temple was full of saints. As I prepared to perform my second endowment of the day, I was given the name of the person I would represent. Surprisingly, the name was the same individual from the night before, Eliezer Searcy. I felt the Spirit of the Lord as the endowment was completed. Later in the afternoon, still in the temple, Kathy saw an elderly family friend, Sister Dolly Fernandez, who now lived in Atlanta. With no male members of her family with her, she asked if I could possibly assist in the sealing of her father to her father's parents. I, of course, was very honored. As I knelt at the end of the altar for this sacred ordinance, I heard once again the name that was now inscribed in my mind, her father, Eliezer Searcy. I fully believe that following this life, I will meet and embrace a man known in his mortal life as Eliezer Searcy.
The experience that Elder Anderson described is actually very common among members of the church who are involved in temple and family history work. There are a lot of miracles that attend that work. These are things that we can personally verify to a much higher degree than abstract questions about the distant past. Continuing, are the gifts of the Spirit evident in the church? Prophecy, revelation, tongues, healings, visions, other miraculous manifestations of God's power? Do the experiments, like we read about in Alma 32, that we undertake in our service and devotional activities demonstrate the desired results? When we live the gospel as taught by the current leadership of the church, do we become better people, closer to God? Do we receive revelation? When we are living the basic principles of the restored gospel, are we a beacon on a hill to the rest of humanity? These are high verifiability questions. They are questions that we can answer personally from our own experiences and observations, and from the experiences and observations of credible, sober-minded witnesses all around us. So returning to this diagram, it bears repeating that if we are rejecting questions about the present, if we are resisting asking questions about how people experience the gospel and whether the power of God is manifest in the things that we do in the church in the present day, if we are avoiding those high verifiability questions in favor of lower verifiability questions that deal with abstract narratives of the distant past, once again, our overall faith confidence level is going to be very low. Now let's apply this diagram to another field, like the field of science. If I avoid the practice of science in favor of studying the history of science or philosophy of science, there's nothing wrong with that, but how much can I actually know about the validity of science unless I am spending time practicing science and learning best practices, learning from seasoned expert scientists who have been practicing in that field for decades. Only the personal practice of science will verify to me that the scientific method works. And only the personal practice of science will grant me a high level of competence in that field. So let's move on to a concept, again related to the study of church history. And I'm going to tell you a secret. I, as a person with some critical thinking skills, have the ability to doubt things. And when it comes to narratives about the past, I have the infinity sign here because there are not 100, 1,000, or even 100,000 reasons to doubt. If you are determined to validate your doubt, there are infinite reasons available to you. Now, here is the other half of my secret. I also have the capacity to exercise faith, to believe. So yes, I have that capacity to doubt, but likewise there are not 100, 1,000, or even 100,000 reasons to believe. If you love the gospel, there are infinite reasons available to believe it. This is why Alma said to Korihor, I have all things as a testimony that these things are true. Now, what gives us that bias toward belief and faith? The answer is conversion. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3, in the conversation between Jesus and Nicodemus, we have a declaration that I think is one of the very most important insights in Scripture. Jesus tells Nicodemus, Truly, truly, I say to you, if a person is not born from on high, that person is not able to see the kingdom of God. Conversion, rebirth, being born again, being willing to be transformed by God and the influence of His Spirit. That is what gives us that divine bias, to see the past in the way that Christ sees the past, which is through lenses of grace and honesty and truth and love, and with an eye toward redemption. That is Christian bias toward the past. And it comes to us when we are seeking authentic conversion to Christ and His gospel. And I'll conclude this presentation by saying from my own personal experience that the very most important realities of the gospel can be verified. They are high verifiability questions, and there are plenty of people around us who have direct witness testimony in support of the truths of the gospel. My testimony does not rely on arguments between scholars about narratives over history. My testimony is of direct personal experience in the present day, and my hope is for the same thing for you. And if you are a church member who's not a church history whiz, I want you to know that that is okay, because once again, the most important questions that we can focus on are ones that we can verify in the present day. Thank you for joining me. This has been an episode of Latter-day Presentations. We would like to remind viewers that our channel represents our own views and not necessarily any official positions of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Thanks again for joining us.